Actually, the most candid about what happened in Gaza were those who were there on the ground, the soldiers. It's very instructive to read their testimony. There are a couple of compendia of what they had to say about what happened. So let me just give you some illustrative examples. Soldier, there was nothing there. Ghost towns, except for some livestock, nothing moved. Soldier, most of the time it was boring. There were not really too many events. Soldier, I did not see one single Arab the whole time we were there, that whole week. Soldier, everyone was disappointed about not engaging anyone. Soldier, usually we did not see a living soul, except for our soldiers, of course. Not a soul. Soldier, go ahead and ask soldiers how often they encountered combatants in Gaza. Nothing, no one. Soldier, there was supposed to be a tiny resistance force upon entry, but there just wasn't any. In his defense of IDF conduct during the Gaza invasion, Hebrew University professor of philosophy and NYU professor of law Moshe Halbertau, he pointed to the challenge facing an Israeli soldier. He said the Israeli soldier had to, quote, decide whether the individual standing before him in jeans and sneakers is a combatant or not. And then Halbertau went on to say that, of course, there was a lot of death and destruction because Gaza is an extremely densely populated area, and the battlefield was in an extremely densely populated area. But if you read the soldiers' testimonies, the really daunting challenge in Gaza was not differentiating between friend and foe, but encountering any foe. No battles occurred in densely populated, or for that matter, sparsely populated areas. But that's only half the story. There was no war in Gaza. There were no battles in Gaza. There was no enemy in the field in Gaza. The Israeli soldiers wanted to tangle with the foe, but there was no foe to tangle with. But that's half the story, as I said. Because if you look at those same publications, for example, for those of you who use the internet for your research, bring up the publication called Breaking the Silence, a publication containing, I think, about 30 or so testimonies. And then when you bring up the publication on your screen, enter in the search function the word insane. And when you enter the word insane in the search function, you'll see once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different soldiers that keep using that word, insane. They weren't cued to use it, they were interviewed separately. It was the word that leapt to mind, because one soldier after another said, Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. No soldiers in the field, no battles, no foe, but they keep saying, Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. One soldier said, this was firepower such as I had never known. There were blasts all the time. The earth was constantly shaking. Another soldier said, on the ground you hear these thunderous blasts all day long. I mean, not just tank shelling, which was a tune we'd gotten used to, but blasts that actually rocked the outpost, to the extent that some of us were ordered out of the house we were quartered in for fear it would collapse. The soldiers commandeered Palestinian homes. They're shooting into the horizon. But the insane amounts of firepower were such that the homes in which they were quartered were shaking, and they were told to leave. One soldier said, "It felt like hunting season had begun. Sometimes it reminded me of a PlayStation computer game." Another soldier said, "You felt like a child playing around with a magnifying glass, burning up ants." I was a kid once. I had my magnifying glass. I'm not proud of it. And I used to focus the sun's rays and burn the ants, turn them into crispy critters. But I wasn't so delusional that I thought I was engaged in a war with the ants. Actually, the metaphor was quite apt, like a child with a magnifying glass burning ants. Israel dropped white phosphorus on Gaza. I had heard about white phosphorus. Israel, it's one of its tools of the trade. But this was the first time I actually started to read the fine print. And it's quite a show, that white phosphorus. It reaches 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, 800 degrees Celsius. What did Israel do with the white phosphorus? Well, Human Rights Watch put out a report on it. It said that, and I'm quoting Human Rights Watch, Israel repeatedly exploded white phosphorus munitions in the air over populated areas, killing and injuring civilians and damaging civilian structures. They dropped it on a school, on a market, on a humanitarian aid warehouse. They dropped it on 2 hospitals. They dropped the white phosphorus on Al-Quds Hospital and on Al-Wafa Hospital. What the Goldstone report concluded was a direct and intentional strike on Al-Quds Hospital, a hospital, as Human Rights Watch said, and now I'm quoting it, was clearly marked, and there does not appear to have been fighting in that immediate area. By the end of those 22 days, 1,400 Palestinians were killed, of whom up to 4/5 were civilians, 350 children. 13 Israelis were killed, of whom 10 were combatants, and half of those combatants, nearly half, 4 of the 10, were killed in what's called friendly fire, accidental killing by other Israeli soldiers. The ratio of killings was 100 to 1. The ratio of civilians killed was about 400 to 1. Doesn't sound much like a war. It sounds much more like a massacre. Or to quote Professor Kennedy in the Harvard Crimson, he said what happened in Gaza was, and now I'm quoting him, typical of a particular kind of, and his words are in quotes, police action that Western colonial powers have historically undertaken to convince resisting native populations that unless they stop resisting, they will suffer unbearable death and deprivation. It's said that the human rights reports that came out, they gave too much attention to the suffering of the Palestinians and not enough attention to the suffering of the Israelis. So if you read the Goldstone report, roughly 10 to 20% of it is given over to Hamas crimes against Israel. If you look at the 5 Human Rights Watch reports, 2 of them focus on Hamas crimes, so about 40%. So the Goldstone report, about 10 to 20% focused on Hamas crimes. Human Rights Watch, about 40%. But the proportion of total crimes for which Hamas was culpable didn't even remotely approach these percentages. Let's leave aside the deaths, 400 to 1 civilians, 100 to 1 on total deaths. Let's just look at houses destroyed. Israel completely or nearly completely destroyed 6,000 Palestinian homes. Amnesty International reports that one Israeli home was nearly destroyed by the Hamas rocket attacks. So there the proportion is 6,000 to 1. There are many moments you can focus on, or venues you can focus on during that attack. And Israel tried to defend itself. So, for example, Israeli attacks damaged or destroyed 29 ambulances and almost half of Gaza's 122 health facilities, including 15 hospitals. They killed 16 medical personnel. Well, what does Israel have to say in its defense? It just published last week a new report, about 350 pages. It's a quasi-official government organization, the Israeli Intelligence and Information Center. I read it. Actually, I read it several times, desperately looking for the evidence. So what do they cite? Well, they say there's lots of evidence that Hamas misused hospitals. It claims that Hamas officials were taking refuge in the hospitals. And it said that Hamas was using ambulances to ferry around militants and weapons. What's Israel's evidence? Well, it cites what it calls intelligence sources. It cites confessions of Hamas militants, which is somewhat problematic since the Goldstone report documents in grisly detail how all those who were captured during the Gaza invasion were tortured in quite brutal ways. And it cites statements by Palestinian Authority officials such as Mahmoud Abbas. That's their evidence. But then every human rights organization, there were many, investigated these claims. There were about a dozen different human rights reports, substantial ones, issued after the Gaza attack. Every single one reached the same conclusion. There is no evidence, zero, no evidence that Hamas used ambulances to ferry militants and weapons, or used hospitals as places of refuge. Even Israel's Magen David Adom, Israel's own Red Cross, testified before the Goldstone mission, and this is what they said. There was no use of Palestinian Red Crescent Society ambulances for the transport of weapons or ammunition. But Israel destroyed 29 ambulances. What about the mosques? Israeli attacks destroyed 30 mosques in Gaza, damaged 15 more. Israel alleged that the mosques were used to store weapons, and it cites what it calls reliable intelligence, video evidence of secondary explosions, and again, those ubiquitous Hamas confessions. The Goldstone mission, it investigated one case in particular, what it called an intentional Israeli attack on a mosque that killed at least 15 people attending services. Its conclusion, it found no evidence that this mosque was used for the storage of weapons or any military activity by Palestinian armed groups. It's interesting, even in the 350-page report, where Israel was doing its best to come up with a defense, it never even attempted to refute Goldstone on the one mosque attack that it honed in on. Even if it were true that Hamas used mosques to store weapons, and that's why they were targeted, there's still a problem. The problem is Israel systematically targeted the minarets in Gaza. And the minarets in Gaza don't contain staircases, and they're too narrow to ascend. So they couldn't have been used by snipers. So why did Israel target the mosques? Well, that question puzzled the impressive international jurist John Dugard from South Africa. And he was on a fact-finding committee, another one, and he concluded, quote, mosques, and more particularly the minarets, had been targeted on the grounds that they symbolized Islam. Well, that's a compelling reason. Can't quarrel with that. Now, we're told that you just don't understand, these Islamist fanatics, these lunatics. They don't understand Western moral standards. They hide among civilians, use them as human shields. We're told that every minute of every day. But the human rights organizations investigated that claim. They all did, one by one by one. That was Israel's last line of defense, the human shields argument. Well, what did Amnesty International find? After the Goldstone report, the Amnesty report's probably the most substantial, the most impressive. Let me quote from them. Contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. Well, but let's say there were human shields. Let's say Hamas was using human shields. Let's say Amnesty is wrong. Let's say the Goldstone Commission is wrong. The Goldstone Mission is wrong. Let's say all the other human rights organizations are wrong. There's still a problem, because the human shielding couldn't possibly account for the civilian deaths. Why? Well, let's hear from Amnesty again. Most of the victims of the Israeli attacks were not caught in the crossfire of battles between Palestinian militants and Israeli forces, nor were the victims shielding militants or other legitimate targets. Many were killed when their homes were bombed while they slept. Others were going about their daily activities in their homes, sitting in their yard, hanging the laundry on the roof, when they were targeted in airstrikes or tank shelling. Children, the 350 children who were killed. Children were studying or playing in their bedrooms or on the roof or outside their homes when they were struck by missiles or tank shells. That's what Amnesty found. But it's not true to say there was no human shielding in Gaza. That would be an exaggeration. all the human rights organizations found ample evidence that Israel was using Palestinians as human shields during the massacre in Gaza. All the investigative bodies, all of the human rights organizations, they reached largely the same conclusion, that Israel committed multiple war crimes and possibly or definitely crimes against humanity in Gaza. They all conclude as well that Hamas committed comparable crimes, but on an incomparably smaller scale. How many crimes can ants commit against a child, incinerating them with a magnifying glass? Give me 1/2 second. Thank you. In April 2009, the President of the United Nations Human Rights Council appointed a fact-finding mission to investigate, and now I'm calling them, all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law that might have been committed at any time in the context of the military operations that were conducted in Gaza during the period 27 December to January 18, 2009. And I appointed Richard Goldstone, the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia.